And Oklahoma State hung around and hung around and hung around, and Quinn Ewers had his worst game. He really did. He had a really bad game.
If he has another one like that, that
was a really bad game, and for whatever reason, and they hung around and hung around and hung around, and they won, and the race pretty much stays the same.
Craig, if you have a 14-point lead and you have Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson, and you're running the ball at 10 yards a pop, or it seems that way, should you ever blow the lead?
I mean, you wouldn't think so, but that's exactly what Texas did, which is why you asked that question. A bad day for Quinn Ewers. The wind, to what extent that played a role. Certainly there's plenty of people that believe it played a major role. I think his inexperience, being on the road for the first time, I think, a combination of factors. I think Sarkisian's play calling. I think, Oklahoma State's defense. I think, a number of things came into play to cause, Oklahoma State to rebound and grab that win, or to come back and grab that win. But, yeah, that was not a game that Texas should have lost, if not for their own mistakes. And I didn't even bring up the penalty part of that. And I know that there is a segment of the fan base that will argue, like, that's why they lost. That's not why they lost. That was a part of why they lost. But, at the same time, there's a graphic out there about how disciplined Oklahoma State is, how they're one of the top 3 or 5 teams in the country as far as least penalized go. And not all of those penalties were judgment calls, by the way, either. So, if you want to throw those in there, you can throw those in there as a reason as to why Texas could not hold that lead. But it's one of like 7 different things. When you've got wide receiver throwing up gang signs to his assistant coach on the sidelines, when you've got, Ewers having his worst day in a uniform, when you have a number of penalties, all of those things added up to disappointment for Texas. And so the little postseason bubble, as unrealistic as that was already going into this weekend with 2 losses, that's completely popped now. For them, the Big 12 championship is still doable, but they don't really have much room for error. For Oklahoma State, just a very resilient, gutsy victory. And I know some will be quick to take that away from them because, there was these penalties. Or, if Ewers would have played better. We can do that with every game with every team that loses. If this didn't happen or if that didn't happen. For Oklahoma State, they could have just cratered. They could have gotten down and just been like, you know what, we're half our team's banged up and injured. Spencer Sanders is at 100%. You know what, it's not our day. And instead, they just stayed in it, and then ultimately popped some plays and found themselves victorious. And I think that's the sign of a champion. I think that Oklahoma State certainly got some help, but they had to finish the job, and that is why I think they're one of the top 2 teams in the conference, and they deserve some love this week, even if it wasn't all they're doing. They deserve a lot of love.
I brought them up.
But when you are good and you do the right things and you don't commit penalties, those things happen for you. And the biggest thing to me was the help they capitalized on. Look, Quinn Ewers, a lot of the things that were going wrong with him were not even things that Oklahoma State was doing to him. He was just turned up too much.
Sometimes Justin Verlander goes out on the mound and he doesn't have it.
Exactly.
I'm not comparing him by any means.
But what makes Oklahoma State good is that there are teams in the country that could get that same performance out of a quarterback who could be elite like Quinn Ewers, who's very talented and has this day where he's sailing everything. He's all over the strike zone, so to speak, Smokey, to follow your metaphor there. And then they don't capitalize on it. What did Oklahoma State do? You're going to overthrow 2 passes to wide open receivers? We're going to get the ball back, and we're going to go score.
By the way, I listened to Mike Gundy. I really started to enjoy the way he kind of looks at football and life, and I didn't do that until this year. I started doing it after the Big 12 championship game. I really loved the way his response was to a devastating play at the end, and I've just kind of liked listening to him. He said that on one of the kickoff returns or one of the kick coverage game, and it might have been early, they had 9 players on a kick coverage team that had never played college football before. You talk about your special teams coaches puckered up, and Gundy actually is someone who handles a lot of the special teams for Oklahoma State. They played 6 freshmen on defense. They're beat up. They found a way, just like they had the big road win earlier in Waco. Yes, they had the loss to TCU, which was bang, bang, but TCU and Oklahoma State are now here. Kansas State's right there, but they have quarterback injury issues that remain to be seen. But right now, TCU and Oklahoma State have separated by just a smidgen.
Yeah, they have, and I think both things can be true. That Texas should have won that game, and Oklahoma State should have won that game. I think that one team ultimately made more plays and played a cleaner, sharper game. And if Texas wants to win a game like that, then cut down on the penalties, because again, not all of those were. The official just has it out for us. I thought that was far too much of the storyline after that, and more of the credit needs to be given to Oklahoma State and how they played, given how beat up they were going into that game and what a question mark Spencer Sanders was.
Yeah, no question about it. And what I loved about Spencer Sanders is all week we discussed whether he was healthy enough to play. He was really good. You put up the list for the Earl Campbell Tyler Rose Award. He had over 300 yards. He managed the game. He threw a bad pick in the end zone, but Oklahoma State keeps going. Baylor beats Kansas. It looked like it could be a blowout, and they had to hold on for their dear life at the end, and they got the huge night, the huge afternoon from Richard Reese.
Yeah, they did. They needed that. I was very concerned in the third quarter and on into the fourth, where they kind of let their guard down again, and that, like, this is what they do. Like they start to balance out the good with the bad too much instead of putting the accelerator down. And they were set up to make that game 35-3 going into halftime perfectly. Ben Sims drops an interception in the end zone, or drops a sure touchdown in the end zone, and then Blake Shaven throws an interception on the next play. It's like when you walk a guy with 2 outs in the ninth. You just start a whole thing. They created an opportunity for a mistake, and they made it. And then from that point on until the fourth quarter, where they realized they had to really put the pedal down, they didn't. And that's what this team needs, is some sort of killer instinct that they don't quite have. They made the drive at the end of the game when they needed to, but they could have not had to do that and probably won the game 42-10.
Yeah, I eventually want to circle back to TCU and talk about them, but for Baylor, that was a big-time win, and that was one that I don't know, man. I'm torn on this win coming out of it. Like, it's great that they won and everything, but the style in which they did it just gives me such little, feel good. To be honest with you. Richard Reese was great. That was a great performance to see. There were some turnovers, and I understand I'm probably grading them on too high of a scale. This is not a Big 12 championship squad, and that's fine to say. Not everybody is. Most of the league's teams are not. 9 of them won't be. But that went from, blow them out and enjoy it and love every minute of it to holding on by the seat of your pants in the fourth quarter, hoping you're not going to have one of the most historically bad losses in program history, right? That's basically what it turned into on homecoming day. And that just, I don't know, guys, about y'all, but that just left such a bad taste in my mouth. And I understand that everybody was enjoying the win, and I enjoyed the fact that they won, because it was sure better than talking about what that loss would have been like. My God, that would have been horrific to have to talk about. But that went from 28-3 at halftime. Should have at minimum been 35-3. Really, you could argue it should have been 42-3 at halftime. And it turned into a 28-23 ball game with less than 10 minutes to go.
Yep.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, I had a bad feeling. I had a bad feeling when Sims dropped the fumble Shapen and the Sims drop pass. Those two plays just golly.
They're about to drive the dagger in. Shapen fumbles, and it's nearly a scoop and score, identical to West Virginia the week prior. They stop, it from being a full run back, but, it turns into a touchdown 2 plays later once Kansas gets the ball, that deep. The Ben Sims drop, there's not an easier touchdown catch in the world to be made. And I understand it was windy on Saturday, so, we're using that for Quinn Ewers as an excuse, or at least some are. I think that did have an effect in some ways for Baylor on Saturday. You look at, a couple of throws Shapen made that were just the way he was throwing it, or the wind, or the combination, or what. They were just kind of funky ducks, right? They were just weird-looking balls coming out of his hand. And, that's going to happen, but... Yeah, Ben Sims, you have to catch that football. Mm-hmm. Everything flipped when you didn't catch that football. Everything flipped, and you're a fifth-year senior, man. That you can't do that. So I'm thankful that they ended up winning the game. I don't want to make it sound like it was just total disaster, because Richard Reese was sensational. The run game as a whole was fantastic. The offensive line got back to their ways of last year, it felt like, and just kind of grinding away. And, Shapen, despite some mistakes, and turnovers are an issue, there's no doubt. He made some great throws. There were things to like, a lot of things to like, but just I felt like they really did themselves a disservice with the way they played that second half, and you had a victory that you could really feel great about, and instead you're like, gosh, man, they almost blew that. Like,
Yeah, it was a sickening feeling as you watched it because there's no question you lose that one. We said it all throughout the week. If you lose that one, you're done. We are going to try to bounce around to a lot of different things. We started out with TCU and Oklahoma State. We're going to get back to TCU. Quentin Johnston put on a show again after being held pretty much in check. They just keep finding ways. The running game, Kendry Miller, all of what they did with Duggan, and their defense is just like playing with their hair on fire, giving up plays, but playing with their hair on fire. So you have Anthony Cook in Texas breaks his arm. He is an assassin back there, and I use that in a way that I would want a guy like that back there. He's the one I think that may have hit Deckers that forced the fumble or created for sure the fumble, although it might have been coming loose before them. And I like the way he plays. Broke his arm week to week on how he responds. You have Adrian Martinez, who was slightly injured against Iowa State, who went out early against TCU. They bring in Howard, and he looks like the starter. He's 28-10, and then he goes out. And so, you have a lot of this going on. This conference, we're seeing a lot of different quarterbacks having to play. Some of them that replace the starters are playing really well, like who Baylor with Baron Morton this weekend.
Yeah, Anthony Cook did have the hit on Deckers that you're talking about, and that is a major loss for them in the secondary. I don't think there's two ways about that. He's played a lot of football for them and is a good player, so that's tough. But, yeah, I mean, I saw, various, I guess, tweets of the kind of the same message as far as just rolling down, like Oklahoma without Dylan Gabriel and what a difference that made for them not having him for some games there, and then getting him back, and you saw them turn around and just beat Kansas and score a bunch of points. It's like, yeah, there's players that are important focal points of teams, and every team, it seems like just about, except for probably TCU at this point, has had some significant injury and two quarterbacks most of the time. That's just kind of the way that it's worked out, and not necessarily for Oklahoma State this past weekend, but they sent out a laundry list of players and several significant contributors that weren't playing against Texas in that game, and just so happened that Spencer Sanders wasn't one of them, but he's clearly still, dealing with some things. So, yeah, injuries matter, and when you're having a run like TCU's having, or like Baylor had last year, that's part of the run, right? You don't see teams like losing a bunch of starters and then still continuing on that run magically. Like, it may happen on occasion. Like, you have your Ohio State story of a third-string quarterback winning a national title, although their third-string quarterback's still probably higher rated than most everybody's first-string quarterback. So, those things happen. But, yeah, I think by the end of this, whoever's got the healthiest squad is going to be, probably in line for playing for the Big 12 title. And for TCU, if they can maintain the health that they've had, that's going to go a long way in them remaining where they are on top of the standings right now.
All right, so some of you, here's C. Jenkins, 14-0 in penalties, way to not make it obvious. They're Big 12 officiating. I love it when Texas fans bitch and moan about the officials. It really kind of almost makes my day.
I mean,
I do know this as well. There were, I think, 2 or 3 penalties that were declined, or they didn't need to take the penalty because Texas was making plays. If it was 1, 2, or 3, but I believe there were 2 or 3 where they were penalized, but the flag was picked up and or declined because Texas didn't need the penalty.
Well, and as we said, too, and I don't know what the final total was, not all of those were, like, not penalties. Like, it's not like
false starts.
13 of them were bad calls. It's like, no, false starts are very much a Texas issue. And so, I understand bringing up 14-0 and how ridiculous that is. I totally understand it. So I think it's kind of unfair to just jump all over somebody saying that, because it does matter. However, that had nothing to do with Quinn Ewers airmailing footballs. That had nothing to do with Sark's play calling. That had nothing to do with throwing up gang signs on the sideline. That had nothing, that had nothing to do with a lot of the other things that also added up to that loss. So, yes, if you want to complain about the penalties, that's fair. That was a weird set of circumstances on Saturday that led to 14-0. That should not happen, or that typically never happens. But that was not the only reason they lost that game.
What I do think, though, had happened to Texas, because, and I believe it's because of, if he saw both of Jatavian Sanders' false starts, he had 2. And that's a tight end with 2 false starts. It usually doesn't happen because most of the time he can see the ball and all that. He's got a little tick that he does to get an advantage before the snap. And it's slight, but it's a false start. And I think either the Oklahoma State coaches or someone alerted the officials to watch 0 at Texas. He has a little bit of a tick that's a false start, and he got caught twice. It might be the first time this year he has. And so those things add up. And there's those other things. So when you start looking for those things, then you start noticing other things. But I believe the officiating crew was probably alerted to that, and it's a penalty. And so they called it, and then they start going, well, guess what else the other things they do? Look at that.
Well, I don't want to spend all damn first hour of this show discussing that. It was a part of it. Also, Xavier Worthy, it's interesting to me that the week before, Xavier Hutchinson, a phenomenal player for Iowa State, tripped over himself or just hyperventilated on what would have been a walk-in touchdown. Texas had the dagger on a throw from Ewers to Xavier Worthy, and somehow in Xavier Worthy, he might be as valuable as Bijan is to them. He just got mixed up. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the throw, maybe it was the route, I don't know, but he fell down, and that was shocking that happened because he catches that and probably game over, but that happened as well.
And here's the thing is, like, the penalties also come into play, not focusing on that, because of the fact that it was still such a close game. Like, everybody's, who's embracing the fact that Texas lost that game, everybody wanted to see it because they wanted to see, like, any, sort of playoff. Like, the playoff talk was ridiculous going into last week, whatever there was. But now it's, like, totally out the window. Like, people love to see Texas lose, granted. But, yeah, like, that was tough because I think Texas sees how, like, as badly as they played with 14-0 in penalties and Ewers having his worst day by far as a college quarterback and clearly some chemistry issues going on, they still were there to win that game at the very end of it. And that's what I think is the most frustrating part. And yeah, I mean, you can point to whatever you want to point to, but there was a combination of errors that led to that loss in Stillwater. And it sure looked there for a while like they were going to grab it. And, I don't know what we'd be talking about or how we'd be talking if they had gone and done that. And I think that's why it's such a double whammy for Texas fans is, that you could have won that game if you just played a little cleaner. Some will default to the excuses, but yeah, that was there for the taking, and they let it slip out of their fingertips. And so kudos to Oklahoma State, and that's why they are where they are.
So Sanders bounces back for Oklahoma State. TCU, they win. We'll look at all the games, look at the schedule. I want to get into a couple